Hello and welcome to Further Inside Chor Leoni. My name is Eric Light, and I am the artistic director of Chor Leoni Men's Choir here in beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. And I am joined today by a new friend of mine, Shruthi Rajasekar, a wonderful composer. Hello, Shruthi. It's lovely to have you here.
So nice to meet you, Eric, and thanks for
It
having me.
is. It is, and I'm so glad that we can have this time to explore some of the work that you're doing because I just think it's super fantastic. You're a composer that I have frankly not known for that long. Maybe been on my radar the last like 6-8 months, and it's just been fun over this time of lockdown to dive a bit into your music, and I'm excited to know a little bit more about who you are. So tell us, if you can give us like the bit of the background bio story. How have you come to be a composer?
Yeah, so my background in music began with Indian classical music. So I was so lucky to grow up in a household of Indian music. My mother is a South Indian classical musician, a Carnatic musician. And so I grew up in that environment and was probably doing music with her maybe before I could even speak. So that was such an amazing, like, osmosis way of learning. And in terms of Western notation, well, I didn't sight read for a long time. I learned piano for a bit, but to be honest, I was sometimes kind of good at faking my way through it and just using my listening skills. But I also had a wonderful teacher who, my piano teacher, also encouraged me to kind of write and make whatever I wanted to. So maybe I wasn't practicing enough of the repertoire I should have been, but I was always creating and just loved
Right.
discovering, different combinations of sounds. Like the mistakes that I would play, even to this day, continue to be the moments where something kind of transforms for me creatively.
Right.
So I then joined choir, and you know that I'm from Minnesota, and you know the state's community of choirs very well.
You can't you spit in the air, you'll hit a choir singer.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
I kind of, yeah, I tripped and fell into one. That's what happened. And I had such wonderful teachers in school who kind of took me under their wing. And even though I really wasn't familiar with this idea of choir, I'd managed to get to like adolescence without knowing too much about choirs in Minnesota, which is really hard to do, I think.
Yeah. You must have had your
The
head in the
blindfold,
sand, or yeah.
exactly. I continue to be that way on, let's be honest.
Understood. And which choirs were you singing with? Did you start with?
Yeah, so I started with my school ensemble, and I went to a high school here called Wayzata High School, which has some really, really great ensembles. And then I also did like all state choirs and other kinds of ensembles that just kept nourishing me. So I was always looking for more and more choir. So these two parts of myself, I mean, this Indian classical singing, and then the beauty of the community work that you do with choirs. And actually, both for me are about community because on the one hand, it's my diasporic community and that identity, and we have such a strong connection with the other South Asian Americans that I know. And then this choral community, and that's what I realized music for me is about that kind of community. So those are the two approaches that I'm bringing in when I'm writing music.
Oh, that's fantastic. And a side note, I taught for 2 years at Wayzata High School, but you
Okay.
were 2 years old when I was there, so our paths did not cross. But we can
Oh
talk
my
about that.
gosh.
We can talk about that later. Um, how did you then get on the road to composing? Because that is taking piano lessons and being in choir does not necessarily guarantee that someone's going to turn out and become a professional composer. There's definitely a journey there.
Perhaps I sort of tripped and fell into it also. Are you seeing a theme in my
Klutziness, yes, I see.
now you know.
Understood.
Yeah, I mean, I was so lucky to have this encouragement around me. So even though I didn't ever really have a composition teacher, I would say in some ways I didn't have like formal lessons until my master's.
Hmm.
But before that, there were so many people encouraging me. So my mom was a huge influence, and in Indian music, any kind of creativity is encouraged and treated with a great deal of respect. So we are taught to improvise, and even in the way that my mom teaches, she teaches the exercises to her students, then she teaches them to then create their own. So you're doing that from the start. There's that attitude. And certainly I had these moments of finding different combinations and different music that I was basically doing in school or in other settings, I would take it to the piano and try to figure out what it is I liked about it so much. And maybe not having those theory skills innately, like not knowing Western music theory, I put in that much more effort to try to understand it and kind of came to sort of hybridize language of my own. So today, even when you look at like the first drafts of my scores, you're going to see a mixture of Indian notation and Western notation, and then some kind of language that only I understand. So it could be
Right.
it's not very helpful for the performers, I suppose. That's why I have to go
Only
through
you
a few
need to know.
iterations.
Yes, at that point anyway. Yeah.
But yeah, that's sort of how the process came. And then again, all of these amazing musicians in Minnesota that mom was collaborating with, that's how I learned about Western musicians and Western instruments, really. Like she would do collaborative projects with them, and they were like my aunties and uncles. That's what I would call them because I was so young. And they would teach me about their instrument while they were doing a collaborative project with mom. So then I got to write for them and did that with a few different ensembles. Some of you might know here, like Zeitgeist, they have like a song contest for young people and for all ages. And I entered that when I was 12, and I didn't even know, I submitted a program note with it, and I spelled chords as CORDS. So that is how much I knew about Western music theory. But they were so kind to recognize that, and then yeah. But that's, I mean, like I said,
Scribbled in an H there just for fun. Yeah.
optional H, I think.
Optional H, silent H. Yes.
Exactly.
That's well, you hinted at one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Western classical music certainly comes with its own traditions and, one might say, baggages and processes and peculiarities. But you grew up with Indian classical music as your background. How have, not in terms of the differences in, maybe I'm not interested in what the product is, but in terms of process of creating music in both of those ways, how do you see the differences? There's a lot of people talking about these sorts of things. We talk about sort of like what every undergrad has to go through for music theory, and is that curriculum the right one to have? And you kind of came up with a very different and equally rich, maybe more rich, musical theory structure. How do you compare the processes that you see from your vantage point in the traditions?
I think an important thing when we're having these kinds of discussions is to sort of be able to acknowledge where every student is coming from. Because I think that actually all of us probably have somewhat of a patchwork background. And when we really analyze it, yes, we might have had you could have had a traditional Western classical pre-college sort of training throughout. But there were probably different kinds of music you were listening to on the radio and loving, and maybe not, getting to study that always in school, but you still equally loved that, and you were maybe singing along or whatever it is. And so I think that the only standard that I look for if I'm like thinking about different kinds of curriculums and approaches is some kind of rigor, basically. So some kind of interrogating, why do I like this? And I think that rigor can be just an immersion. It doesn't have to be a Roman numeral analysis for it to mean something rigorous, but it's some kind of playing around with things, experimenting with things, trying it, and just again and again immersing yourself in trying to figure out what it is about it that appeals to you specifically. And that's, I think, how I found my musical language, and I think how a lot of people find it too. So certainly I do think that the structures I don't think that we need to do away with Western music theory, because I think for some people the structures of that are very, very useful. And for me personally, it was actually very useful when I finally did learn it. It was great to have that vocabulary to describe it. But for me, I think it lives a little bit deeper because I acknowledge the vocabulary that I already had. I didn't just replace this. I didn't replace my pre-existing system with Western theory analysis when I got it. I didn't treat one as with more reverence than the other. I think they're both valid ways of thinking about music and making music. And so that's where I think in the academy we start to fall down, because there are still these ideas that this kind of music is higher than this
Right.
kind of music. And I think that the
And we could
more we
talk a
can break
long time as to why people think that, but we'll leave that for another day. Yeah.
Yeah. But breaking that down and basically, so long as everybody can come at it with that intensity and be able to just keep, questioning why it is that they like that and keep finding new things, I think everyone's gonna develop, rich languages because of it.
Sure. To just keep going down that road just a little bit, because I think this is really fascinating. In terms of, let's say just theory, and we were talking about maybe like some of the mechanics that you have to do when you're composing a piece. To what extent are you do different pieces lead you think, okay, I'm going to have a little bit more Schenkerian analysis on how I'm thinking about, or I'm going to spell my chords this way, or I'm thinking about the piece, in terms of classical Indian structure. Do they vacillate? Do they occupy the same space? Is there one or the other? Is it mix and match for you? How are you negotiating that in your own head?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an ongoing process. And I remember one of my college professors when I was about getting ready to graduate from school, he said to me, his name is Dan Truman. He's an amazing composer, and for him coming from a couple backgrounds of like physics interest, I think he was a physics major at Carleton actually in Northfield, all the Minnesota
Here
connections.
we go.
and then switched to composition. That very much comes from sort of a computer-based background, but also is a player of the Norwegian fiddle too, and very immersed in that kind of folk tradition. So he said to me that these two things that you've lived with them your whole life, but they will continue to deepen. And at the time, I kind of thought, I've explored a lot of these. These are my languages. It's not. I don't feel
Right.
that they're like. I feel like they're native languages to me. I don't feel like a foreign speaker of them. But he's absolutely right that in every piece, it continues to be a navigation where sometimes I'm actually thinking more in terms of your question, which is a great point. I think it's actually sometimes more about workspace than it is about like this language versus this language of music. Because in this harmonic language versus like swara based or raga based Indian music language. So if I'm working with blank staves in front of me, I think that results sometimes in a certain kind of music. But
Right.
if you look at my manuscript paper will have swaras sometimes written under them, where I feel that the swara is the kind of Indian solfege system. It's both Indian solfege plus Indian alphabet, because it's all we have. We don't have another A B C D E F G system. So they're everything, swaras. They mean a lot to me. They're my friends. and and
Good friends, yeah.
I mean, that's
With friends
now
like
you see
that,
what
yeah.
kind of child I was, right? I mean, this is why I was so like into music, because these were my friends. But making notes, sometimes it's more salient for me to describe it in swara terms, and I will spell a vertical chord in swara. Now, because Indian music is really not a harmonic system, that's not a thing that's innate to the music, but it's innate to me in a sense. So working though on a manuscript paper, I might be kind of thinking in a certain way. And then if I'm making like a mock-up of the piece, which is sometimes a creative space that I'll work into, is sort of like different recordings to figure it out. I'm still very much an oral musician, even though I can now finally read. That is a very different way of thinking. And sometimes it's very Carnatic based, but sometimes it's Carnatic plus polyphony will happen a lot in that space. Whereas I'm noticing that homophony kind of tends to happen on the page potentially. So it kind of depends on what I can sort of audiate in my head a little bit. But yeah, it continues to be, it's sort of a workspace navigation more than it is even this or that. And then kind of whatever comes out, comes out.
Right. Now, I'm not sure this is always what a conductor's job is, but I know some people believe this is our job is to try to look at what was written on the page and try to decipher what some of those original intents were from the composer. So let us say for a moment that I'm doing a piece of yours. Maybe it's music that's on the looks of it non-Carnatic, that it would be, I could look at it and go, it looks like a Western choral piece, let's say. But it sounds like possibly through your process there are little Easter eggs and nuggets and ways that you came to your decision making, which is part of my job as an interpreter, is try to frankly crack that code. And I think every score is a little bit of, if you're going to be a performer, is trying to figure out what were they thinking, how do I get to the deeper truths of all of that. Are there, first of all, do you think there are ways that if I just, I didn't know you, I didn't call you up, we didn't have this conversation, I get this score, are there clues that you think would be inherent in your scores that I need to figure out? Or another way of asking that is, are there things that I should be doing to discover what those little clues are as to how you came up with what you came up with?
That is an amazing question. Um, Thinking of the piece that we're going to be working on, for example, if I can take that without, I won't give away its name, but I'll talk about it in a
There's no
somewhat
secrets
generic
here.
way.
We're all friends. Yes.
Okay. So
Secrets don't make friends. So we want to be friends.
I don't know. My only friends are swatas, so I
There
wouldn't
we
know.
go. Oh my.
My apologies.
It's all right.
um, taking "Do Not Stand at My Grave and Weep," for example.
Yeah.
I think that's a piece that very much on the page can look like you don't see any gummacums on them. The gummacums are those motions between semitones that we have. It's written in Western notation. It's not written in Swata. And so I think
English language. Yeah.
English
I mean,
language, yeah,
yeah.
that small fact, yes.
Yep.
I think that you could definitely look at that piece, interpret it without sort of any background on the Indian music that is embedded in there, and actually do an amazing job performing it. I think that's possible, actually, and I think that that's the case because while I really love being involved in the process and I love the conversations that go beyond the score, and that maybe comes from, I came from a tradition where we have a notation system in Indian music. We don't try to make it encompass everything. We treat it as a skeleton. So I do think that there's great things happen sometimes when we move away from the score. I also so respect the performers being a co-author of that piece. So if to co-author it, they want to keep some distance maybe, and then find their own interpretation of what this music means, I think that's like perfectly valid. Now, where I hold myself responsible is I try to give some information in the program notes or performance notes, even more than that. And it's sort of your decision if you want to take that. In the case of "Do Not Stand at My Grave and Weep," I mentioned the fact that it is inspired by this idea of a raga malika, which is a garland of ragas, is what that term means. And I think when you read that, even if you don't know what are the particular ragas, you might start to see, right, for these few measures, we're kind of in this mode. Even if you don't know the raga, you can see it as modal. And so then we're starting to step into the direction of Indian music. And I hope that would maybe help you as a conductor to bring out even more things from the piece. But I also think that in the case of that piece, I think you would make something really, really beautiful, even if you never talk to me.
And I'm glad we're talking. Would do okay? Do if I go through this piece of yours that we're talking about, and decipher. Okay, I see where she's using this raga and other aspects of Carnatic music. Do I get a better performance, in your opinion?
That's a great question. I think you might get something maybe closer to what I intended. But I would think that it's possible, maybe in the case of this piece, to get something that's quite different from maybe what I intended, that could still be very moving because of the power of the text, I think.
Yeah.
Now, there are pieces, other pieces of mine, where I actually haven't yet even made the score available for some of them, because they were created for the first time in, I was in a residency with the ensemble, or we were able to workshop it so closely. And this is where I really strongly believe the score doesn't tell the full picture. I know that because I tried to notate it to the best of my ability, and there are just some things I can't do with it.
Yeah.
And so I don't actually make it available. I ask you to contact me, and then we can start that conversation and see how we can bring it to life. But yeah, I think there are a couple different categories of my music in that way. I'm still figuring it out, though. Maybe you'll have ideas, Eric, of how.
Well, I don't know, and it's also I have not personally grown up in another type of music. I don't have another language. I was only brought up in Western music, so I think I'm here to learn, not certainly not to teach. But you bring up a question that I really wanted to ask. So, I'm a settler conductor. I'm interested in Carnatic music. I'm interested in the work that you're doing, bringing that music into the world of 21st century choirs, whatever that means these days. Are there approaches that I need to have given my background and my identity if I'm going to be doing a piece of yours that is like explicitly bringing Indian music into the fold?
That's an amazing and super thoughtful question from you. So let me just say thank you first, for even thinking in that way. It's easier for me to talk about it in a generic way than it is to say, yes, when you're doing my piece, I need you to do this differently. But
whichever, seriously, take it however you want, whatever you think is the best way to answer it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote an article for the series that was hosted by I Care If You Listen and the American Composers Forum that was called Out of Context. And it was a response to these kind of conversations where it's sort of the catalyst was a kind of prominent ensemble that does work in sort of different styles. Some people who are practitioners of that, and including actually a very prominent Canadian musician who bravely sort of spoke up about it, kind of called that out. And then there were all these questions about, what is acceptable and what isn't. And it's constantly shifting as we all learn more. What I said in that article, which was advice for people who want to bring in kind of different music into a pre-existing setting, let's say, is to sometimes, if you're bringing in a practitioner, which is I think a little bit different than what we're talking about, but if you're bringing in a practitioner, like say if the piece calls for Indian musicians to perform it with you, maybe there's some value in the conductor sort of stepping aside and asking that musician if they want to lead it, if and only if they're comfortable and if they think that would do justice to the piece. And I think I've had experiences before, and I'm sure you have, in the so many different settings you've been in, not just as a conductor, but even as a performer, where if you're doing those kind of collaborative performances and we're working so hard to get this new language in the choir, and maybe sometimes there's some movement associated with it because it's a particular music culture that doesn't separate dance and music, perhaps. And there's all of these things about it that are different code markers than what we have. Yeah. And sometimes it feels like we're mimicking it and we're just really not getting very close. And I just wonder, those are the moments I was thinking of when I wrote the article. Like,
you're a bad cover band. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Doing our best to move, but we're choir, our bodies are stiff. And so, and the thing is, the great thing is, choirs themselves are changing the makeup of them, and members from within the ensemble are sometimes able to train their colleagues. But yeah, it does make you wonder sort of what is the purpose of what we're doing. This is a great experience for us to learn. Maybe we're doing this to learn about something else. But when we put ourselves in the position of being the people to share this to an audience, are we by accident like making ourselves an authority on this of some sort? And how do we navigate that? So I do think sometimes stepping aside, collaborations where you maybe like really highlight that person bringing in, and so you are bringing them to a new audience so that they get that connection, and then the audience is also learning something more. I think that can also be valuable, just as we also want our ensembles to step outside of their comfort zone too. Sometimes it's maybe just not just stepping outside, but stepping aside.
Right. And I think conductors can sometimes, well, certainly historically, they they tend to take the place of the genius is flowing out of some sort of baton, and if I'm not there controlling it, then what is the point anyway? When in reality, our job is to facilitate, and sometimes the best facilitation is get off the podium. Uh, but you also bring up another question, and you mentioned this before. Some pieces you have not written down, and I think there is. Well, I wanted to ask your perspective on if you are writing a piece of music down and publishing it, selling it. I would assume you kind of know who that intended audience is. It's probably, North American choirs. Nine times out of 10, you're going to be like having a North American SATB choir. And we sort of know who those, we know where you're putting your music, where that's being marketed, et cetera, et cetera. To what extent do we have responsibilities? Yeah. Okay. So you've put that out there. Is that enough of an invitation for me or anybody that looks like me to perform the piece?
That's a great question. And that's where I think about what it means to even put the piece out there.
Yeah.
And then if you're selling it too, that's an interesting relationship of it. And it's so weird in some ways how our industry has been,
Isn't it? Yeah.
modified in that way. At the same time, people, I guess, have to eat. So we can't just, I guess, throw all the shackles of capitalism away. Sorry if that was too far for your audience.
Composers of the world unite. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Whatever. Yeah.
And it's interesting as an exchange, and you're selling the score, but that's just, that's products. And what we talked about at the beginning of this was process, which is what actually we're all trying to do, is create a process. And the process doesn't end with the score. The process only begins in some ways when it's getting realized by people. So, or by computers, if you're writing for computers. So in the case of, putting out a piece, I do think that composers have to think about their responsibility in doing that, because you're kind of inviting anyone to then program it. You might even be asking people to program it. I think it becomes a situation, potentially, if you're doing like works on sensitive topics. Actually, this is something that we should think about. I wrote a work that's very, very political work, and about migration, and I actually really struggled to write it because I was kind of worried that it would just end up being something that gets programmed. And there were so many thoughts with this piece. I wrote the text, but I read a lot of poetry by amazing authors who have more direct experience with particularly the southern border of the United States, and also worked with an author to find such people. And I really wanted to make sure that the piece is also a little bit about my own experience as a second generation immigrant. So I am in it, but I wanted to make sure first that I wasn't speaking for anyone else, and how could I be an advocate? So part of that includes in the score, there's a list of authors that I'm like, please read these people's like far better poetry than anything I have written. Right. And, extremely evocative poetry. And the reason that I wrote my own text was honestly, their poetry was so powerful that I didn't think it needed to stand with music. I thought it was powerful on its own. So with this piece, it was one thing about me being like, am I speaking for these people? I thought a lot about it. If I wrote it, and then I was like, maybe this just stays here. But okay, I did the project, and I worked with the first singers who were the ones to do it. And we spent more time talking about the piece than rehearsing, which is so unusual that you can get that, but we got a chance to do that. And it was really powerful because they were British singers, and they had no direct experience with even the geography of what I was discussing, of that kind of border. And so for them to have that kind of eye-opening, and it was uncomfortable sometimes, the conversation. I think I really made them uncomfortable sometimes, but that was good. We needed that. But then after that, somebody was really keen to publish it, and it got published. I really hesitated with actually publishing that, and I was okay with it because the publishers really understood the intent of the piece, and they were very, very thoughtful with it. but it's true. Now it's out there, and I think that I think about that a lot. I wrestle with that decision in some ways because I would like everybody who approaches the piece to only come to it if they have good intentions of wanting to unpack these and have these difficult conversations and maybe even contribute monetarily to causes that are fighting against these issues. But then I also know, as much as I love our field, there is, maybe it comes from the fact that, conductors have to put programs together with themes and they need to sell tickets and all of this, but there's a little bit of a bait kind of type of concert.
Yes.
Sometimes the bait of issue bait. And I never thought I would ever encounter that, because I never really liked that when I was growing up. And if I had to
Mm-hmm.
sing in pieces that to me felt a little performative in our interaction and on the surface really with the issue.
Right.
So anyway, this is no answer. This is just my existential crisis of all of these, of what it means to put something out there. But I think that ultimately, we have to hold that responsibility. I think that's where a lot of our issues have come from, that people have pushed away the responsibility. As a composer, I took sounds from somewhere. I'm not responsible for telling people where I got those from. Actually, I think you are. You do need to share who helped you in your process. So
Well, and I think we're increasingly, as I'm approaching, well, really everything. We're really living in a time. I feel like we just need to just show our work, and if you do that, and you also it cannot be about us without us, and taking those two things to heart, it generally leads you down a path and a process which avoids a lot of, I think, a lot of the pitfalls, and that I'm certainly seeing, and I'm seeing it more and more, frankly, in the choral arts than I am many other ones. And I think a lot of it is coming out of a place to do some good. But I think occasionally the cart gets before the horse, and we lose our way as to why we're doing this and for whom this is benefiting. Do you see a process possible whereby I can still buy a score, but can get put through a process, like that I have to go through a certain process to be able to perform this piece? Western notation is, I think, a bit addictive because we can read it, we can just do it, and that's great. But as you're saying, that's just not enough. I mean, I'm riffing here, but can you imagine any sort of a way that we could have a bit of like the selling of the score sort of thing, but also that insurance of a process?
great question. At a small scale, I do that now with pieces that I self-publish, in that
Uh huh.
it's an interesting phenomenon that's allowed me to do this. It was a problem, but it's actually quite interesting. So it's the digital world of selling digital goods, like basically selling ebooks. In our case, we're really maybe interested in selling scores and getting like a PDF that we can immediately use. It doesn't, in most cases, you can't sell a product that's digital and have like multiple copies, like, because it's a very much an ebook market. They don't understand that idea of like a choir wants 40 licenses to print this. And
Right.
so this is an interesting thing I ran into when I was talking to different stores, and I was looking at the way people do these things, and they either design their own basically, or if they're using one that's out there, they have to use like preset options, which I wanted people to have the chance, if they want to buy like 63 copies of something, like I want you to have the chance to do that and not just have to buy 100. So what ended up happening for me is that all my instrumental pieces are available as digital things that you can immediately get as a download, and there's that instant access, which we are all so used to now. With choral scores, unfortunately, customers who are buying them from me, it is unfortunate on one hand, but I think this is where I'm able to regulate it a little bit. They have to buy the score, and then I get a notification that they've purchased it, and I've got a note that it'll come to them 24 to 48 hours later, and I email it to them. And in that email process, I have an email message that talks about like how important it is to me to to be part of the process, not in a way that's like, please include me, but if you want anything from me, I am here and I love coming and visiting. And people have, strangers have taken me up on that, which has been really, really cool. That is one way of having, and the other thing is at least they have my email address, which they might have had anyway. But then they feel, I think, like when they get that email, they feel more comfortable than if it's just the digital code of the instrumental pieces to feel like they could ask
Yeah,
something.
it's not just Mozart. You're like a person with an email address. Yeah,
A very, very accident prone person. So you want to
clearly. We've
talk to me.
established that. Yes.
But I think with publishers, it's a little bit more tricky. But I actually had a conversation recently with my publisher about, maybe we can have, it was like a forum of multiple composers talking about their different processes with various publishers. It's kind of like a panel discussion.
Yeah.
And I said, maybe we need to have something on the page where it's being sold, which is, it could be something as small as an intro video from the composer, like just talking about the piece, to all the way to, hi, I'm available to talk about this, and I would really like to talk about it with you. So here is how you contact me and how we start that. So I feel like that's actually possible for publishers to do. It just, it does require more work from them, more work from the composers, but I personally would be all for that.
Yeah. Well, it's all requiring more work, and I think that's what we've got to realize. Like we can't. The days are over of just buy the score, learn the notes, sing the song. Why is it important for you to put Carnatic music into a choral form? This is, I'm not trying to be a challenging question, but I think it's an interesting one. You are kind of rubbing these two worlds together in just the creation of this, and this problem, which is also, every problem has opportunities as well. You're sort of creating this problem in a way. Do you know what I mean? And that's not to say anything bad about it.
Could be a lot easier than I've made it, basically.
Well, plenty of Carnatic musicians don't decide to transcribe or make works for SATB choirs. So you are operating in the two worlds, but why to you is that important?
There are a few reasons, and I'm thinking about individuals who have reached out to me because of a project or something. So, for example, I had a piece that was featured in some kind of newspaper in the UK, and reached the attention of a musician in Australia who is a Indian Australian, like Indian by origin, but had never played a piece by an Indian composer and had never actually interacted with Indian music. So they grew up playing in their double basses. They grew up playing in an orchestra. And I think they had like relatives who were maybe doing Indian traditional music, but these worlds are kept so far apart too. I think Indian classical musicians are a little bit better than Western classical musicians on the whole about trying to reach out a little bit, just because maybe it's a numbers game if we're in the, if we're the minority. And so we try to reach out a bit, but then there's also those who are just, they're doing their own thing, and they have their own concerts and they have their own audience, and they can be happening in the halls next to each other, and there's no overlap in the people who are going to each. So anyway, this player, phenomenal double bassist, he reached out and he said, I've just never seen anyone like you. It's almost like, like you're just weird. I mean, what is this? But we've ended up like actually collaborating. And what's so cool, that collaboration is cool, but what's really cool to me is he is now learning Carnatic music from a teacher in India and adapting it for double bass. So we have violin in Indian music because it came over with the British in the 1800s, and then it got retuned and refingered and everything. So now it's played differently, and it's played sitting down on your lap, but we have it. And he is finding ways of making that happen on the double bass. And I'm aware of a cellist who's doing things like this. And there's many adaptations that are happening. Saxophone's been brought to Indian music in this way. He's going to still keep playing in orchestras. I want him to keep playing in orchestra. This isn't about him like bringing him over back to the cultural side, bringing him to the dark side or anything like that. It's just so cool for us to find these connections and to have that experience, because I don't know if there'd been more composers like me out there that had been playing, if he maybe would have, I don't know if his journey might have been different, but it's not that his journey needs to be different. It's just, there are these unacknowledged parts for a lot of us who are minorities or just basically have felt different for some reason, which encompasses a lot of people in this world. Yep. When you see yourself in that piece represented, it just sparks so many new things. In his case, it's a new adventure of, and super cool at a technical level of bringing this music onto the double bass. But it's also just connection and feeling like you belong. And recently I spoke to an ensemble, a choral ensemble, where there were a lot of South Asian students, which I had never seen in a choir. Growing up, I didn't see, which I think you've seen firsthand. But there are places in this country and maybe in Canada as well, where there are more and more students who look a little bit different in the choirs. And we were talking about choral music, and it's not like they need to go do Indian classical music or Indian Bollywood music or any of that. Western music can be their language, but it was just so special to, small things. They knew how to pronounce my name, and they felt special that I knew how to pronounce their name. And it was, just these connections, they're everything to me. It's so fulfilling to see people light up because it's like, hey, I know about that. Right. When it comes to people who are encountering something new for the first time, I feel like our relationship, I might just know them as colleagues, but then when we work through this, we get to know each other as people so much more. So it's not even just working with people of Indian origin or coming from minority background or whatever it is. We start to see each other as people, as individuals with their particular quirks. And that transforms the music that we're working on. I don't know how to explain that. You must know that from all of the projects you've done, that when you see that collaborator in that way, oh my gosh, it's magic, right? Yeah. It's indescribable.
It truly is. And you're making me very homesick for getting to sing in choirs, which we cannot do at the moment of this conversation. And you bring me around then to my last question. What is this that's special about choirs in your eyes, in your ears, and in your heart? You walk in many different worlds. You're writing instrumental pieces. You're doing more traditional. You're with your own singing. But what is, in your eyes, are there special expressive qualities that a choir has? Are there things that it does differently, better? Does it have some liabilities as far as like what it is? Why are you drawn to writing for these voices?
I have visited different kinds of ensembles, and as I'm sure you've experienced too, chamber ensembles of instruments that are not the voice can have a really intimate sense of each other. That's for sure the case. But I don't know that I've ever experienced anything that goes as far as choirs. It's in choirs that I've had my most vulnerable moments as a singer, but then also as a composer. I can come into the room having not met the singers before and having not met the conductor before. But by the end of our time together, there's so much intimacy that we have. There's so much trust that we have, which is why these issues and discussions of inequities, they hurt so much more in the choir world, because we feel like a family. We are a family. Yeah. Like any family, sometimes we need a little bit of work. We need to talk things out sometimes. But
oh yeah, family. I can.
But we are this. Oh my God, there's just nothing encompasses the word community like a choir does. And it's really amazing to me because I operate in different musical settings, and I love the kind of sense of each other that you get in Indian music, specifically when you're improvising, because what happens is you're improvising and then the accompanying artists don't even know what you've planned. They are predicting what you're going to do before you know what you're going to do. And that is something very, very special and magical. So there's a sense of that I think that's another reason I'm bringing in Indian music ideas. I'm trying to, when I write aleatoric things, I'm trying to slowly kind of bring that into every choir's repertoire. I know some choirs do that a lot already, but bring that idea in. But you're not going to cry as much with any group as you are with the choir.
There it is.
And it's a cliche, but it's the most beautiful thing.
Yeah. I We do feel here, at least here at Chor Leoni, that we, as the greatest fundraiser ever, would just be selling Chor Leoni handkerchiefs for all of the tears that happened, both on stage and off. And I miss those tears terribly. This has been just an extraordinary pleasure. I could talk with you all day about all of this, and perhaps someday I will. But I want to thank you so much for sharing this just unique perspective and beautiful one, and one I think that we all need to be listening for, and just truly a delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me for these phenomenal, thought-provoking questions. And I can't wait for us to meet in person and to get to work with Corleone as well.
It's gonna happen. Thank you again.